Hi, I'm Kathy Brennan, Director of Educational Products and Services with the International Society of Arboriculture. I'm very happy to bring to you today our Conference Rewind video series. Today's presentation is Quantifying Climbing Efficiency with Dr. John Ball. So this presentation was originally given at the ISA 2020 virtual conference, and therefore, of course, the viewpoints and information given are those of the presenter. So if you're interested in learning a little bit about the history of climbing systems, as well as some of the latest research on climbing efficiency, then I'm sure you'll enjoy this presentation. So now sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the ISA Virtual Conference. My name is John Ball. I'm a professor at South Dakota State University in Brookings, South Dakota, and I'm here today to talk to you about climbing performance. I also want to add that Tim Walsh with Davey is very much a part of this research and will be expanding it for his PhD program over the next year or two. So we're going to have even more data on about another 18 months, I hope. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to start with looking at the progression of climbing systems over the last decades. And then how do we measure human performance? So when we're looking at climbing systems, how do we evaluate one to the other? And then what have we learned so far with the data we've collected on the various climbing systems in terms of efficiency, human performance, and then finally at the end, I'll spend a few moments talking about climbing safety. I would like to start out with arboricultural operation incidences. I do spend a lot of time working on this. And as a reminder, according to OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the United States, in the U.S., we have about 13 fatalities per 100,000 workers in the general category grounds and tree workers. I should also mention that if we pool every worker in the United States together, we have a fatality rate of about 4 per 100,000. So just in this general category of landscapers and tree workers, we have about 3 times the fatalities of the all industry average. If we just separate out tree workers, and Michigan's OSHA did this recently, we have about 48 fatalities per 100,000. So really doing tree work is more than 10 times the risk, if you will, at least the fatalities that occur to the all industry average. And if we look at where those injuries occur, notice that falls to lower levels are about 34% of our fatal injuries in the United States, looking at data over the last 15 or so years. And if we look at the non-fatal injuries, and by this category, I mean injuries that resulted in inpatient hospitalization for at least a day, amputation, or loss of eye, that falls to lower levels, and climbers really are the category where we have the most non-fatal injuries. And a lot of this may be due to fatigue. You know, you're doing a job, you're up there, you're getting tired. How much does that affect your thinking or your strength? So that's a real key part of the research that we're doing. Well, climbing's had its starts a long time ago, had its start in Europe, of course. But when we take a look at climbing, how have our systems changed over the decades? In the beginning, we did a lot of free climbing, and free climbing even occurred, as you can see in these pictures, up until the 1950s and even the 60s. And I remember free climbing a little bit into the 70s, even though it certainly wasn't advised. I think it's interesting. If you go back to the early literature, they looked at it as trying to convince people to use a rope. And where did we start? We really started here with a buck strap, and I've kept mine. That's an old leather buck strap. It's 50 years old, and I certainly wouldn't use it today. And I'm glad I survived using it back then. But our climbing systems have changed quite a bit. And we started using a climbing line. Now, these became a little bit more common in the 1930s. And they certainly were in use during the 1970s. And from then since, we've always used a climbing line. But have you ever seen anyone climb like this? Now, what I want you to notice is that's a manila rope and going hand over the rope. Believe it or not, that was a technique that was utilized once. In fact, if you go to the February 1983 issue of Journal of Arboriculture, you'll find on the cover this picture. And this is a student at a university I will not mention that was instructing their students in climbing a tree, just as that picture that I just showed you illustrates. That he has his saddle on, but you'll notice the D rings are hanging down because he's pulling himself hand over hands over that rope. Now, if you go to that issue and to the next several issues, you'll find a lot of letters to the editor. And there was one in the following issue that said, I find it inexcusable for you to use this cover picture on the February 1983 journal. And the following issue, the author and the photographer mentioned that we allow students to climb either as body thrust or hand to hand. Your words of excusable are a little strong. Now, that really started a conversation. But the point of this, too, is that notice even in 1983, our climbing systems were relatively simple. Body thrust or hand to hand were both fairly common systems. And we routinely would free climb to the tie in point. I can remember this. You trailed your rope all the way up the tree until you got to the height that you wanted to be. You tried to find as central of a point as you could. And only then did you tie in. And then, being tied in, you'd work the tree down. That's my harness, my saddle from back then in 1983, I believe. And it's one of the originals. If you'll notice that this was a buckle that you pulled the strap through. They discontinued those because too many people wouldn't go through and add that extra loop. And so they went to buckles to help reduce having the chance of having the saddle come off you. We still were using manila ropes back there at the end of the 70s. And that's typically how I was taught to tie on. What you used were 2 half hitches tied off on a taut line hitch. A figure 8 knot is a stopper knot because anyone that remembers a taut line knows that it would roll as you were working, and fairly soon you'd find that figure 8 knot pulling almost up against the knot. And then for those that wonder, well, what's that other figure 8 knot? That was the knot to where to cut your line if we had to do an aerial rescue. Well, we're not using manila ropes anymore. We've certainly gone to a lot better materials, and we've gone to a lot better techniques. So let's go over them. Now, of course, SRT, stationary rope technique, as it's now called, has really become a very common way to climb and work a tree. And there's a lot of advantages into this system. But what about efficiency? And I hear this a lot. Well, what is the more efficient method? Well, the first thing, as Shigo would always tell us, is you have to define your terms. And so, what are we actually measuring when we talk about efficiency? And that's what I'll start out with here. Now, we're going to use real climbers, not these. And I got this photograph from Tom Dunlap, where we're going to put all our little mechanical people through various climbing techniques and do that. No, instead, we're going to work with people on these techniques. And rock climbers have studied efficiency for a long time, and a lot of our literature really comes from them. We're really just starting to look at efficiencies for climbing systems for arborists. And as a rock climber, I kind of appreciate the work that has been done looking at rock climbing. And I'm glad to see that we can actually take some of that work and their methods and apply them to arboriculture. So let's borrow some of the methods that they have. Well, we started out practicing in the gym using some of their tools and techniques, working with sports medicine department here at South Dakota State University, and we set them up in the gym and practice to refine our measuring techniques. And so let's go through the systems that we use to measure climbing efficiency. First of all, we're looking at VO2. V stands for volume and O2 stands for oxygen. And this is a measure of an individual's capacity to transport and utilize oxygen during exercise. It's a measure of aerobic fitness, and aerobic fitness is important for rock climbing, and it's certainly important for tree climbing. The VO2 is really the rate of oxygen consumption. It's the rate used by the body, by the way. It's not the amount inhaled. We're really not talking about the huffing and puffing here as you're going up the tree. And I do want to point out that aerobic fitness is only one component in measuring efficiency, but it's an important one. Everybody here as an arborist is well aware of these formulas: photosynthesis, that process of converting water and carbon dioxide into sugar with light energy. And then, of course, there's respiration, one we don't talk about as much, but that's the release of that energy captured in photosynthesis for cellular activity. Well, you're not undergoing photosynthesis, but you all are undergoing respiration. And so when we look at human respiration here, we're essentially taking sugars and oxygen and then giving off carbon dioxide, water, and producing ATP. ATP is really what transforms us into mechanical energy. If you want to think of it as ATP as diesel going into the tank, right? That's what really provides the energy to allow you to do your work. And so we're going to measure VO2 with a couple techniques, and I'm going to show you one we've utilized in the past that we're changing now to more modern systems. But this is a technique that actually you can wear. It's used for climbing, for rock climbing, and we modified its use for tree climbing to take a look at oxygen consumption among climbers using different climbing systems. The system goes on over the shoulders. The holders are there. The holders don't weigh, the harness doesn't wear very much. And what we end up doing is placing that cup over your nose. Now, initially, when you put that on, you think you're not going to be able to breathe. But we use this on treadmills. We use it for runners. We use it for a lot of various athletes. And after a few moments, surprisingly, you can get used to the system and realize it does not interfere with your breathing at all. What it allows us to do is measure your oxygen consumption. So there's the entire setup. Now, with all electronics, they're improving dramatically. So we're going to a newer system, which is a analyzer that just fits over your mouth and your nose there, and still using a small piece like that. But we're able to get rid of all these various lines that are attached, and it's Wi-Fi'd right to the computer. So it's making it a little easier to work your way through a tree when you're wearing the newer systems. But even with this system, it's not bad. We can fold those cords underneath there so they're not in your way, and the sensors go in those pockets. So as you're climbing, it doesn't interfere with your climbing as you're working your way up the tree. Now, at rest, your VO, oxygen consumption essentially, is about 3.4 milliliters per kilogram per minute. I realize that is kind of, well, it's hard to put a basis to it. But if you just remember that number at rest as you're sitting there watching your computer, when you're looking at your oxygen consumption, it's about 3.4, between 3 and 4, mostly close to 3 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of your weight per minute. So what we also have to do to make this work, we have to weigh all the people and get their heights. So we get all the basic measurements of the participants, and then we also get all that baseline data that we need. Not only are we going to measure their oxygen consumption, but we're also going to measure their heart rate. And that heart rate can be Wi-Fi'd as well because oxygen consumption is dependent on the heart to pump out the blood because that's the way we move oxygen in your body. This is one of the systems that we're using. It's fairly small and easy to do. It's also Wi-Fi'd and you don't even notice it as it's being worn as you're climbing through the tree. Heart rate for most of our participants is at about 65 beats per minute. Now, for the average adult, it varies somewhere between 60 and 100, but arborists are athletes. There's no way to get around it, particularly climbers. You have to be in good shape. So you're going to be typically at the low end of that. And some of you may be even lower than that are runners and that and may have a heart rate that is at 60 or even in the 50s. Generally speaking, there is a linear relationship between your oxygen consumption and your heart rate. In other words, as your oxygen consumption increases, as you're breathing heavier, moving more oxygen through your system, right, that your heart rate's going to go up. And that's true as well with climbing. However, one of the things that we'll point out here today is that it's not even, that the relationship is not quite the same as it is for other activities. So we're going to get the person geared up, put everything together. Again, we can Wi-Fi this, so everything's coming right into the computer and we're able to evaluate in real time two of these, their oxygen consumption and their heart rate. So we're getting both pieces of data continuously as they're ascending the tree. And for our practice here, that's what we're looking at, is merely ascending, because obviously that's where you're going to have a lot of oxygen demand as you're working your way up into the tree. And what techniques are we going to use just for this small trial here? Well, let's start out and take a look at the Tree Climber's Companion. And in there, he talks about the basic climbing techniques. Now, a lot of you may be watching us say, I don't body thrust. I get that. I understand. Surprisingly, there's still quite a few people that still do this. So it was worth considering. And for those that may not be familiar with climbing body thrust, it's where you place your feet high on the tree trunk, thrust your hips forward while pulling down on the rope. It's a pretty energy intensive way of working up the tree. And for those you remember doing this back in the 70s, I wore out the inseams of all my jeans because you were continually pulling your legs up, trying to pull yourself up to the next branch. And obviously, this would be part of a movable rope technique. Following that, and actually seemed rather modern at the time into the 80s, was what we called a modified body thrust, which is still utilized, in fact, quite a bit. And this was where, as Jensen describes it, the climber rocks back and forth and forms a lock on the rope, stands up on the footlock, and advances the hitch. Those you remember looking at the videos back in the 90s on tree climbing, a lot of them discuss this technique. And as I say, I still see a lot of arborists utilizing it today. Well, then we also have some stationary rope techniques rather than a movable rope technique. This used to be referred to as a single rope, but obviously we're only using one rope. So a better description of it is as a stationary rope technique. In other words, you're moving on the rope is not moving. One of the other ones that showed up in actually in the 80s and 90s was what we called the secured footlock. Now, footlocking was used before that, but it wasn't secured. You literally just climbed the line until you got up to the first branch, and this was a technique we used for getting up to the white pines out east. But the secured footlock obviously provided that extra level of protection, and that's what we have been utilizing. And if you go back to the videos done on tree climbing back in the 90s, you'll see this technique showing. And this is where, as Jepson describes it, the climber grabs both ropes, and by that he means both ends, with the hand below the friction hitch, raises the leg, foot locks the rope, stands up to advance the Prusik loop or any other loop that you're using. And then now, of course, there's a multitude of SRT systems that are being utilized, a lot of different mechanical advices as well that are being used. And so we have a lot of systems in which to evaluate. But for today, we're only looking at one to compare it to the other three. And obviously, this is where the climber incorporates two attachment points on a single rope. Now, they're all single ropes by which the climber alternates weight transfer. And I'm sure a lot of people that are watching this, SRT, a technique like such as this, is one that you're utilizing for most of your work. Well, let's start out and measure this. Well, first of all, again at rest, we're going to take a couple of our participants here. Heart rate of about 57. Again, some of them have a lower heart rate than 60. Again, they're fairly good athletes as well. And the average VO2 at rest of about 3.5 milligrams per kilogram per minute. Now, their VO2 max, in other words, what's the maximum oxygen consumption that they can have, is about 48 milliliters per kilograms per minute. Now, by the way, that is not hereditary. You don't have a max that you are born with, and that's as good as you're going to get. Now, certainly there's variations in capabilities of all people, their baseline, but nevertheless, with training, you can increase that. Cyclists, for example, competitive cyclists, which really depend on aerobic fitness, many of those, their VO2 max is 80, almost twice as high, because cycling is a very much an aerobic sport as well as running. But you start at rest, and look what happens the minute you start going up that rope. Your heart rate, which was somewhere in the high 50s or low 60s, is now pushed to 166. Your VO2 consumption, which might have been at 3.2 to 3.5, has spiked to 41. Now remember, your max for a lot of these was about 48. So when they're really working to go up that line, they're exerting a tremendous amount of energy. And every climber here that does this understands this. So let's look at the four systems. And again, this was just a brief trial here: body thrust, the modified body thrust, the secured footlock, and then just a SRT technique without going over all the mechanical devices. And a fairly small pool of people, four, and the same four tried all four techniques. What I want you to notice is on these ascents, take a look. The one that required the most oxygen consumption, no surprise, was the body thrust, and really the modified body thrust at 29 to 25. And again, you might say, well, on your last slide, you show it going up to 41. And that's correct. But if we take a look at the long climb, continuous climb, this is what it would average out at. And then take a look at the heart rate for body thrust, 183 as a spike, 168 and 160 down there for the SRT technique. So if we looked at efficiency, in other words, a climbing system by how efficient it was, and really what we wanted to look at was oxygen consumption, what technique resulted in the lowest oxygen consumption and the lowest heart rate. Clearly here, SRT is the system. And I also want to point out that every time the arms were working above the heart rate spiked. And again, those weren't continual heart rates. They would spike at that. And what we find with climbing, and this was found also with rock climbing, that there's a disproportional increase in heart rate to VO2. In other words, climbing is not as much of an aerobic sport as cycling is, for example. But nevertheless, we are going to push our heart rates quite a bit. And one way to push your heart rate is get your hands above your heart, above your head, and pull. That is where your heart is really working. And this has been found in numerous studies that due to the upper body pull, the arms working above the heart, right? That's where you're maximizing that heart rate. These old techniques, and here's a body thrust. I believe this picture is probably about 12 years old, and this was a company. And you can see as he's raising his legs, getting his legs as high as he can. And then what he's going to do is pull with those arms. And by putting your arms above your head and pulling, working your arms, takes a tremendous amount of energy. Any system where you can reduce that arm pull, particularly the arm pull above the head, is going to be more efficient. And efficiency by measuring really energy consumption here, oxygen and the heart rate pushed to move that oxygen through the body. So again, take a look at again, heart rate of 57, VO2 at rest of 3.5. And as I mentioned, their VO2, which we can measure as well, was about 48. I mean, they're fairly good athletes. And that is the maximal potential for using oxygen to make ATP. Now, what they found in rock climbing, again, is you can perform at about 60% of your VO2 max. In other words, you can push yourself that high, but you can't hold it. And for tree climbing, that's critical because you're not just climbing the tree. When you get up in the tree, you've got to work the tree. So just exerting yourself to the maximum level that you can to get up there is not efficient. You want to keep a technique that's about 60% of your VO2 max. And if you do that throughout the day, you can actually work the day with those techniques. And as I mentioned before, your VO2 max varies among workers. I mean, one of the things that's nice to do is actually measure it so a climber has a base. In other words, we know what you're capable of doing right now. Now, as I mentioned, this can be improved with training. Anaerobic activity is going to improve this. Running, spinning, cycling is going to do that. And a lot of people don't think of those as activities that climbers would do to improve their efficiency or performance. And as I mentioned, it's not all your performance, but nevertheless, improving your aerobic fitness is a big help. And those activities can do it. If we take a look, people that are sitting a lot, which is unfortunately most people, their VO2 max is going to be less than 29 or 28. In fact, it would no surprise to anyone here. That's where most of your customers are. The people that look up in the tree and say, well, I would do that if I had the rope. No, you probably couldn't, because quite honestly, they don't even have the aerobic fitness to actually be able to move up a rope, let alone the strength. Moderates between 30 and 44. High, we're getting into athletes, is greater than 45. When we take a look at a lot of arborists, and we haven't measured as many as we plan, you're really looking at somewhere in the 40s to even the low 50s if they're also runners besides. And as you can see here, 26 is about 60% for this group. So using a secured footlock and obviously SRT systems is really the way to do, so you do not fatigue yourself during the entire day of work. Thought you'd be interested in this too. If we look at the climbing event, the belayed speed climb, where you're climbing that predetermined route from the ground to about 18 meters. I looked at the times over the past several, and they generally range, and I say generally range from about 23 to 50 seconds for this climb. And those that may not be familiar with it, essentially you are being belayed and you're climbing. You can pull on the line. You can also use the branches, and you're actually going up the tree almost as though we rock climb, though with rock climbing, we're not using the line at all. It's merely there for fall protection. And for rock climbing, if you're climbing at the rate of about 9 to 12 meters per second per minute, excuse me, you're often at your VO2 max. Now, again, with climbing, it's not running, it's not a sprint. You're not always operating at high speeds. You can rest or go gradually up the tree there. But that belayed speed climb is actually where you're going to be closest to really maximizing your oxygen consumption, because you're just pulling yourself branch to branch to branch using the line up about 18 meters. And so it's equivalent to rock climbing in a gym, for example, where you're just trying to go up there as quickly as you can. But again, look at that heart rate. That heart rate really gets pushed when we're climbing. And one reason is that you're putting your arms above your heart. That's going to increase it. Another, though rather minor, is anxiety, the fact that you're doing an activity at which you could fall. As climbers, we're all pretty accustomed to that environment, so anxiety actually is a fairly small percent of it. So really, it's all about the legs. Use the legs as much as you can, not the arms. Just like rock climbing. One of the things I teach in my rock climbing class, and this is our sent up Devil's Tower, is lift with your legs, hold with your hands. And that's fairly common. I like this quote out of the REI, Intro to Rock Climbing. Feet are the foundation of climbing. Lots of beginners try to pull themselves up on the wall and quickly tire out. Think about climbing a ladder. You don't pull yourself up, you step up and use your arms and hands for balance. It's the same with climbing. And we really need to consider that more with tree climbing. Now, with tree climbing, we tend to climb the line more than we do the tree these days. And so, as much as you can, use your leg muscles rather than your arm muscles. It's far more efficient. And as we say, when you pull, you can actually see it. Pulling, that heart rate goes up. And then when you're resting, that heart rate goes down. And why that disproportional heart rate rise to oxygen consumption? I've already mentioned it's getting the hands above the heart. But one of the things we don't realize, it's also the gripping with the forearms. Now we get that with rock climbing, as you can see here, as he's working his way up, that you're gripping. So think of that grip strength as well. And if you really look at it, it's that rhythmic where you're gripping and releasing, you're gripping and releasing, you're gripping and releasing. That also raises your heart rate. And if Charlie's watching this, and he always comes to TCI, and often I say he is very big on grip strength. And if you ever shake hands with him, you'll know grip strength. And Charlie's comment, which is absolutely true, is that people don't have quite the strength that they used to. And we need to do more to get a better strength on it. And again, we're going to be measuring this as well. Haven't done quite a bit of it yet, but once again, having good arm strength, grip strength, actually is going to help. And what we have found is that you fatigue slower, no surprise, with the better strength that you have. So what do we know so far? Well, climbers are made, not born. And I think that's good. That a lot of times you look at it and say, oh yeah, that they're going to be a climber. I can't. No, you can be. Anyone can be within reason. And what do we know about good climbers? And we're taking this from rock climbing because this is an ongoing study. So utilize this. But again, tactical route decisions. Good climbers know how to read a tree. They know how they're going to get up in the tree. They know how they're going to work the tree. They know how they're going to come down. They've got it figured out. That's going to provide efficiency. Good grip, and they can rest their hands. You ever watch rock climbers? Will drop the hand down and shake it. Okay. Getting that blood flow going again. Something we need to do more when we're tree climbing. Take care of that grip. Obviously have a high VO2 max, and upper arm strength is still important, but should not be overutilized. So where do we use the most energy? I thought you might find this interesting. And a reminder, at rest, you're using about 3 to 3.5. We ran through a couple of other exercises just for fun, and we'll take one of the students here, and that was her rate. And by the way, she's also an excellent rock climber, so certainly has the aerobic fitness you need. And let's run her through a lot of other activities, right? And measure them as we go. Ascending. Ascending is where you're going to use the most energy, and that's not a surprise to anyone here. And it doesn't matter what technique you're going to use. That requires a lot of energy to ascend a tree. But it's not much less when you're actually moving through the tree and working through the canopy. That does drop a bit, but not as much as you might think. And of course, descending, yes, your activity drops quite a bit there. But nevertheless, it's still a way above rest. Operating a chainsaw, yeah, look at that. About 20 to 22. And there's other studies that have shown the same thing with chainsaws. It's more energy than you might think, but if you really want to burn yourself out, drag brush. Dragging and chipping brush, which you're going to do on a longer time period than climbing, perhaps, is incredibly energy intensive. And anyone here that's dragged brush understands that. Well, what about flying an aerial lift? They ought to put a cup holder in those buckets because you know what? If you look at three or that being what you're burning just as you're sitting here today, you're only doubling that when you're flying the aerial lift. That's the job you want. Well, as I mentioned, let's take a look at some of the challenges that we have utilizing SRT here. Let's talk a minute here on safety. Well, first of all, our techniques have changed quite a bit. We've now got these small throw bags that we can fling way up into the tree. And if we can't, we can actually use a big shot and get them farther. That's a big change from the old throw bags we used to use, the throw pouch. And as I mentioned, back in the 70s and even a little bit into the 80s, it was fairly common to free climb to the top of the tree using 3 points contact, tie in, and then work the tree coming down. And we were taught always take your line and make sure it goes around the trunk over a branch union as a stop. And that was the technique that we did because you were standing literally right there. And in fact, it was a requirement in the United States until 1994 in our Z standards that the climbing line be positioned over a branch union and around a trunk, as this illustration shows from an earlier publication. And obviously, if you do that, that's a fairly safe connection. It's not going to fail or a very low probability of failure. But nowadays, we're often isolating it with a canopy anchor for doing SRT. And canopy anchors are great. There's less force on that tie-in point, right? There's less bounce in the line, but you've got to isolate the line, and obviously it's harder to retrieve. And as Kane has pointed out in a number of his excellent articles here in Arborist News, that you better make sure you've got it anchored just right. The farther out that is, the greater dynamic amplification, that sway frequency. So you want to stay at or within a foot of that union. Too often we're shooting the line way up there, can barely see where it is, and we're too far out on the branch. Should be there. And I've seen these fail, and Tim did as well. We were both out at this climbing competition as they were setting up. Someone put a line up there, put their weight on it, and it snapped. And by the way, it snapped when he'd already started climbing. Fortunately, it wasn't hurt. And we have that in our Z, the US safety standard, that when climbing a rope, you're supposed to begin by inspecting the anchor point, and then if suitable, subject it to a weight approximately twice the weight of the climber before climbing commences. But really, does that work? And as Brian Kane's written a number of articles on this in Arborist News, and I have, Tim and I have one or two as well. And what we found is that two people don't pull with a force, a tension equal to their own weight. You can't pull with your own weight if you're still standing on the ground, right? So if we have two people stand on the ground and pull, they're not pulling with their own weight, and their weight may not be that of the climber. In fact, if you're standing on the ground, it's about 60%. So if we have 280-pound people, they're going to pull with a force of about 220 pounds. The climber can exert about 1 to 1.5 times their weight. So a 180-pound person is actually pulling with a weight higher than greater than their weight. And in fact, if you look at this, two people pulling can exert less force on that rope, on that anchor point, than one person climbing it. And that one person, it's oscillating. They're loading, loading back, loading back. And so this is one reason we do get tie and point failures. Now, you can use a basal anchor rather than a canopy anchor, and these are obviously easier to retrieve, and we can use them as rescue. And unfortunately, there's going to be greater force at that tie-in point, that primary suspension point, and there's going to be more bounce because you've got more line built into the system. But that ability to retrieve is so valuable, and this is what we practiced at the Tree Care Industry Association's Aerial Rescue Symposium last year, that it is handy in being able to retrieve the injured worker. But a climber here is going to exert about 2 to 3 times their own weight. Okay, 180-pound person, 360 to 540 pounds. And you don't want to sway at all. Well, what you can do, of course, is try to get that basal anchor as far out as you can. You want to increase that angle. And we found that in that what was called the single rope technique, which is now the stationary rope technique, of course, that the farther the angle out, the less force on that primary suspension point, your top anchor, and more force on your basal anchor. It's not a major change, but it does help. So what we take a look at is trying to get your basal anchor tied off on another tree, because you can see your basal anchor. But that anchor up above, our top anchor, our primary suspension point, which you may not have seen it because you're climbing up to it. So we want to reduce the amount of force on that. However, I would like to mention that even though it's a great system to moving the weight more, transferring that more to your basal anchor, the more you angle out, the more obstacles between you and what you're climbing. And we did have an unfortunate incident in the industry in the United States where someone drove down a road in which they had that basal anchor tied off, and the top of the truck actually caught the rope, pulled the climber out of the tree, and unfortunately killed her. Well, closing here, what about some other injuries? And again, I'm taking this from the review that Tim Walsh, Shane Vosberg, and I did, and was published this year in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, that if we look at all the fatalities, 20% of our fatalities are to climbers. Now, remember, I mentioned it was in the 30s, so we had aerial lift operators in that, and 31% are to climbers. Why are they? Well, 3% of all our fatal incidences are your tie-in point failing. A lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of these are SRT techniques, and they're just having too much force on that top anchor. And that's also about 7% of our severe non-fatal injuries. And I might mention that many times they have tested it. Now, we don't know exactly how many. We don't have data that fine. But there often is the comment in the incident report, well, we tested it. And then they climbed it. And in some cases, they climb about a third the way up before that anchor fails. And again, it's that oscillation, that force, that force, that force, as you're continuing to work your way up on that line. Repositioning or changing systems. And again, if we take a look overall of all our fatal incidents and all our severe, 4 and 6% is a fairly large number for a single activity. And these are consistent. By consistent, I mean we've had these ever since we've been using climbing lines. That in that moment when you're switching systems or that, you decide I'm not going to use a lanyard. It's only going to take a second. A second, it's all it's take for you to lose your balance and fall. We also have where you cut your own line. Most of these are with chainsaws, but Brian Kane also has an excellent article that shows rope under tension can be cut very easily with a handsaw even. So again, having that 2 points where you have your climbing line and a lanyard around the tree when you're operating a saw is a requirement and a darn good idea. And then we also get them, unfortunately, contact with electrical conductors. Either indirect, you drop a branch which touches the wire, or the climber actually touches the wire. And then finally, cut by a chainsaw. Chainsaws are not many of our fatal incidences, but there are a large number of severe non-fatal, and almost all of these occur to climbers. And as a reminder, in the United States, ANSI Z133 safety requirements for arboricultural operations, we do have in there that a chainsaw shall be operated with two hands at all time, one hand on each handle with the thumbs wrapped around the handles. There's a subpart to that, and the subpart can never violate the part, but it's often confused. And what it says in there is that you should always operate the chainsaw with your left hand around the forward handle and your right hand around the rear handle, unless it's not practical and the employer demonstrates a grazer head is opposed by operating a chainsaw that way. What that means is that the employer's option, you can reverse hands. It does not mean you can one hand a chainsaw. In the United States, according to our safety standards, there is no exception that allows you to operate a chainsaw one-handed on the ground, in the tree, in the aerial lift, period. And when we take a look at our serious incidences, quite often they're to the left arm. Why the left arm? Because someone was operating a chainsaw in the tree with just the right arm. Because of that, too, in some countries, you are required to carry a first aid kit with you when you climb. Not a requirement in the United States, but it's a darn good idea, and I know a lot of people do carry them. Again, since the major risk you run is a chainsaw incident, you do need to have something for chainsaws. And for me, it's one of these tactical tourniquets. I merely mention it here today. It does require training to utilize one, but they are becoming far more common in first aid kits. And I certainly recommend them for climbers. Because that is the way to actually stop a blood flow that is caused by a jagged chainsaw cut that's going to allow you to survive until someone gets you down or you've managed to get yourself down. And then finally, when do you have to carry a handsaw aloft? All the time in the United States. Essentially, when your feet leave the ground, make sure you have a handsaw with you as well. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present here today. If you have any questions, I can be reached at any time. We do have a chat box too, and I will be checking that during the conference to make sure I've answered your questions as well. And I may get Tim involved in here as well. I hope you enjoy the conference, and I thank you for your attendance.